The second hand on the wall clock didn't tick so much as hesitate. It moved, then seemed to listen, as if the room might object to it going any further. Someone had wiped the glass earlier. There were clean streaks where the cloth had passed, and a faint smear where a thumb had checked the edge. Under the clock, on a narrow shelf, sat a tin cup filled with pencil stubs. The stubs were arranged by length, like someone had tried to impose order on what was left. A man at the far table kept turning a paperclip between his fingers. He wasn't clipping anything, just turning it over and over, the metal catching the light, then disappearing as his hand rolled it into shadow again. Every few turns, he stopped and looked toward the door as if expecting the paperclip to change its mind and point somewhere else. The door stayed closed. The stove in the corner made small, tired sounds. Heat expanding, settling, expanding again, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to work. A kettle sat on top, lid slightly skewed, the handle wrapped in cloth. No one touched it. No one asked for tea. The kettle was there because kettles were supposed to be there in rooms like this. It made the waiting feel ordinary, almost domestic, if you didn't look too long at the faces. A typewriter sat on the desk near the window. A sheet of paper was already fed into it, aligned with care. The roller had been tightened until the paper could not move without permission. A single letter was struck near the top, slightly off-center, as if someone had begun and immediately stopped. The ink looked fresh, darker than the rest of the room. It was the only thing that felt alive. In the hallway outside, boots passed at regular intervals. 2 sets, always the same cadence. One pair heavier, slower. The other quick, almost impatient, as if the wearer hated the sound of his own steps and wanted to outrun them. Every time the boots went by, the man with the paperclip paused. Every time the boots continued. The lamp above the table hummed. The filament inside burned steady, yet the glass shade trembled with the faint vibration of the building, a shiver too small to be seen unless you were already watching for it. Someone had tied a string around the lamp chain to keep it from swinging. The string cut into the wood of the table where it was anchored, leaving a shallow groove, the mark of repetition, the evidence of hands that came back to the same problems again and again. A pencil scratched somewhere, not writing words so much as tracing lines. A map lay open on the desk, edges curled from being unfolded too many times. A ruler rested across it like a baton, as if the map could be conducted into obedience. The man tracing didn't look down as he moved the pencil. He stared at a spot on the wall beside the window where the paint had bubbled from old damp. His hand remembered the route even when his mind refused to. There was a radio set on a small stand beneath the window, its dial glowing faintly. The volume was turned low enough that it could be mistaken for static. Every now and then a voice pushed through, fragmented, clipped, swallowed by interference, then vanished again. Whoever had said it like that had made a choice. Not silence, not clarity, but the middle ground where you could pretend you weren't listening and still catch what you feared. A match struck. The brief flare of sulfur light painted the room in warmer colors for an instant, revealing details that the dimness politely hid. Sweat at a collar, grime under fingernails, a bite mark on a lower lip that hadn't healed. The match went to a cigarette. The cigarette glowed. The man inhaled and held it, as if even smoke needed to wait its turn. Nobody spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because any sentence would have to land somewhere. It would have to be heard. It would have to belong to someone after it left their mouth. In the hush, breath stayed private, throat stayed still. Even the chair legs seemed careful when someone shifted their weight. One of the men, younger than the others by a few years that looked like a lifetime, kept checking his watch. Not with urgency, almost with superstition. He lifted his wrist, looked, lowered it. Lifted, looked, lowered. The leather strap was too tight. It left a pale line on his skin. The watch face had a hairline crack running from the number 7 to the center, like a fault line on a map no one wanted to acknowledge. At the window, the curtain was pinned back with a bent nail. Outside, the light had the washed-out quality of an overcast afternoon, the kind of gray that made it difficult to tell whether the day was ending or beginning. Somewhere beyond the glass, something mechanical droned and paused and droned again. An engine idling, a generator catching, a distant machine being tested and tested again. In the room, a folder sat unopened, its flap tucked in like a sealed mouth. A stamp lay beside it, ink pad closed. The stamp's wooden handle was worn smooth from use. The folder had been placed precisely between two other stacks of paper, as if it had always belonged there. Yet nobody's hand drifted toward it. Nobody reached for the decision that waited inside, because reaching would make it real. The man with the paper clip finally set it down. The sound was soft, almost apologetic, but it cut through the hush with the sharpness of a dropped needle. Every eye flicked to it, then away again, embarrassed by how quickly their attention could be captured by something so small. A phone sat on the wall, receiver cradled, cord coiled neatly. The bell had not rung once, and still, everyone listened for it, their bodies holding a fraction of tension in reserve, like a muscle that never fully relaxes. In the hall, the bootsteps stopped. There was a pause long enough for the stove to settle with a faint ping, long enough for the radio to produce a single clear syllable before dissolving back into noise. The air changed in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. On the other side of the door, someone exhaled. Inside the room, nobody moved, but the clock hand, after its long hesitation, clicked forward again, one small, indifferent jump, and in that sound was the simplest truth of the day. There wasn't much time left. The door didn't open right away. That was the first cruelty of it. How the building insisted on its own procedures, even when everyone inside had already felt the shift in the air. The latch remained still. The hinges stayed silent. Whatever waited on the other side took its time, as if the pause itself was part of the message. Then there was a knock, not loud, not urgent. 2 measured taps that sounded less like a request and more like a confirmation. The man nearest the door stood up too quickly, caught himself and smoothed the front of his shirt with both hands. The fabric was already flat. He did it anyway. When the door finally opened, the hallway light spilled in, colder than the lamp's glow, bleaching the room for a moment. The figure in the doorway didn't step fully inside. He stayed framed by the corridor, leaving his shadow behind him like an afterthought. In his hand was a narrow envelope and a ledger book held close to his ribs, the way men carried things they didn't want to drop. No one asked his name. They all knew him by function. He handed the envelope to the man at the desk without ceremony, then placed the ledger down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as though the room demanded straight lines. His eyes went once, briefly, to the radio set beneath the window. The dial still glowed. The static still breathed. "Still nothing," someone said, and it was almost a relief to hear a voice, even one that sounded wrong in the room, as if speech had become an unfamiliar tool. The messenger gave a small shake of the head. Not nothing, exactly. More like not enough, or not what you want, or it doesn't matter now. He didn't clarify. Clarification was dangerous. He turned and left the way he had come, closing the door softly behind him. The latch clicked, and with that click the room went back to itself, sealed, private, obliged to continue. The envelope lay on the desk like a live thing. The man who'd received it didn't open it at once. He moved it an inch closer, then stopped. His fingers hovered. He looked toward the map, toward the typewriter, toward the radio. He was taking inventory of the room, as if he might find an alternative hidden among the objects. Across from him, the younger man with the cracked watch leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly enough that his knuckles lost their color. He didn't look at the envelope. He stared at the floorboards, counting the dark seams between planks, the pattern of wear at the threshold where countless boots had passed. Outside, the engine droned again. It wasn't loud. It was persistent. It had the quality of something that could run forever if you kept feeding it. A thin vibration moved through the window glass, making the pinned-back curtain tremble. The bent nail holding it caught the light and flickered like a tiny signal. Someone poured water into the kettle. The sound was delicate, liquid meeting metal, almost gentle. The act felt absurdly normal, the kind of thing that belonged to a kitchen, not a room with a sealed folder and an unopened envelope. But the man who did it moved with a practiced calm, as though the ritual might anchor the world in place. He set the kettle back on the stove and adjusted it by a fraction, aligning it to the burner as if alignment could prevent misalignment. The stove began to warm. The familiar, tired noises returned. A soft ping. A settling creak. "Tea?" the man asked, voice low, almost embarrassed. No one answered. Not yes. Not no. The offer hung in the air and slowly faded, like breath on cold glass. At the desk, the man finally slid a finger under the envelope's flap. He didn't tear it. He opened it with care, preserving its shape, as if the paper itself deserved respect. He drew out a single sheet, unfolded it once, then again. The paper was creased sharp, official. Ink sat on it with the confidence of an order. He read in silence, lips barely moving, the way some men pray without wanting anyone to see. When he finished, he didn't look up. He set the paper down beside the map. His hand rested on it for a moment, palm flat, as if he could press the words back into the fibers and erase them by force. Then he lifted his hand away. The others waited. The waiting was different now. Not open, not curious. It was the waiting of men standing near a train track, hearing something heavy coming through fog, unable to see it yet but knowing what sound meant. The man with the cigarette took a drag and let it out slowly. Smoke moved across the lamp's light in pale layers, making the room seem underwater. He stubbed the cigarette out before it was finished, grinding it into the ashtray with a patience that bordered on anger. "What does it say?" someone asked, and the question came out strained, too thin. The man at the desk didn't answer immediately. He reached for the stamp, then stopped, fingers hovering. He reached for the ink pad, then stopped again. He looked at the typewriter and the blank space beneath the single-struck letter, as though he could start a different sentence and escape the one waiting to be written. On the wall, the phone remained silent. The receiver sat in its cradle like a sleeping animal. Finally, the man spoke. Not the content, not the details, but something else. A tone. A weight. "They want it entered," he said. Entered where? Logged under what? Filed in which drawer? He didn't say. The room understood. There were only so many places a message like that could go. The ledger lay open now, pages ruled in faint blue lines. Names and times and numbers filled the earlier entries in careful handwriting. The blank line waiting at the bottom seemed wider than the others, as if it anticipated the shape of what was coming. A pen was uncapped. The sound was small, but it tightened the air. Across the room, one of the men, older, shoulders rounded from years of carrying responsibility that wasn't his, walked to the window and looked out. He didn't press his face to the glass. He kept a respectful distance, like the view might accuse him of something. Outside, the gray light continued, indifferent. Somewhere beyond the building, vehicles moved in the slow, obedient patterns of routine. Men walked with their collars up, hands tucked in pockets against the cold. A cigarette ember glowed and vanished on a street corner. Normality still performing. The man at the desk dipped his pen into the ink. He wrote the date first, as if giving the moment a proper name would make it less dangerous. The pen scratched softly. His hand was steady. That steadiness felt wrong, like a lie the body told to protect the mind. When he reached the space for the time, he paused. He glanced at the wall clock. The second hand moved with its same hesitant insistence, step by step, refusing to rush, refusing to stop. He wrote the time anyway. Someone shifted in their chair. Wood creaked. The younger man with the cracked watch finally looked up, eyes going not to the ledger, not to the order, but to the doorway as if he still expected it to open and provide a different future. It didn't. The radio whispered again. Static, then a faint voice, then static. A phrase almost formed and then broke apart, leaving only the sound of distance. No one adjusted the dial. No one reached to make it clearer. Clarity was not what they were waiting for. In the corner, the kettle began to whisper as it warmed, a thin sound like breath drawn through teeth. The stove pinged once, then again. The building settled around them as if preparing for a long night. The ink on the ledger line dried as it was written, each letter fixing itself in place. And still, outside the window, the world kept moving the way it always did. One footstep after another, one engine idle after another. While inside that room, a quiet was forming that had nothing to do with peace. It was the kind of quiet that arrives when the day is still pretending to be ordinary, but the clock has already chosen its direction. The first thing to go wrong was so small it almost passed for imagination. A faint rattle traveled through the window frame. Just one brief tremor, no stronger than a truck passing too close to the building. The glass shivered and settled. No one commented on it. In a place like this, structures made noise all the time. Age spoke through metal and wood. If you listened to every sound, you would never get anything done. Still, the man at the window straightened without realizing he'd moved. His hand rested on the sill. He kept it there longer than necessary, feeling for another vibration that didn't come. At the desk, the ledger lay open to its fresh entry. The ink had dried, but the words still felt wet in the mind. The man who had written them closed the book carefully, aligning its corners again, restoring the illusion that order had not been disturbed. He placed the stamp on top of it, not using it, just covering the line, as if the weight of wood might hold the moment in place. Across the room, the younger man's watch clicked softly as the second hand passed over the crack in its glass. Each rotation made the fracture flash, a brief glint like a signal light. He caught himself staring at it and turned his wrist inward, hiding the face from view. Superstition had a way of sneaking into rational rooms when no one was looking. Someone laughed. It was quick, almost reflexive, the sound a man makes when he realizes silence has gone on too long and tries to puncture it before it grows teeth. The laugh didn't carry. It dropped into the space between them and vanished. "Feels like one of those days," the man said, offering the words the way you offer a match in the wind, half expecting it not to light. No one asked what kind of day. The kettle on the stove began to steam, the whisper rising into a soft hiss. The man who had filled it earlier stood and moved toward it, grateful for the excuse. He lifted the kettle and poured water into chipped cups lined on the counter. The steam fogged his glasses. He didn't wipe them right away. For a moment, the blur was easier to live with. As he passed the cups out, hands reached automatically. The porcelain was hot. Fingers adjusted. Small nods were exchanged, thanks without words. Normal gestures, familiar choreography, the kind that suggested continuity. The radio crackled again, louder this time. A voice came through more clearly than before, though still fractured, as if it had traveled too far and lost pieces of itself along the way. Numbers were spoken, then a pause. Then the same numbers repeated, slower. Someone frowned. "Is that the third time?" he asked, casual, but watching the dial closely now. "Fourth," the man by the window said. At least. No one moved to turn it off. No one reached to tune it in further. The repetition sat there, unresolved, like a sentence waiting for its verb. A file drawer stuck when someone tried to open it. The man tugged harder than he needed to. The drawer gave way suddenly, jerking forward. Papers inside shifted, a whisper of dry pages rubbing together. He muttered an apology to no one in particular and pushed the drawer closed again, slower this time, as if it might take offense. Outside, the engine that had been idling cut out. The sudden absence of sound felt louder than the noise had been. Several heads turned toward the window at once. Through the glass, movement continued. Men walking, a vehicle rolling past, but the steady mechanical presence was gone. "It'll start again," someone said. It was said with certainty. Engines always started again. Machines were dependable in that way. If they didn't work, it was because someone hadn't followed the right steps yet. The man with the cigarette case opened it and closed it without taking one out. He checked his lighter, flicking it once. Flame appeared. He shut it off. The test was enough. At the desk, the typewriter sat untouched. The single letter on the page seemed to stare back at them now, accusatory in its incompleteness. The man who'd struck it earlier reached for the carriage return lever, then stopped. He flexed his fingers instead, as though working stiffness out of them. "Courier's late," he said. "No," another replied, glancing at the clock. "He's early." The distinction mattered more than it should have. Early meant expectation. Late meant delay. Neither word brought comfort. From the hallway came the sound of a door opening, then closing. Voices murmured briefly, then faded. The building was awake, active, breathing, but the activity had begun to feel misaligned, like a machine running out of sync with itself. The radio voice returned, now accompanied by a burst of static sharp enough to make someone wince. A phrase slipped through, incomplete but unmistakable in its tone. Not panic, not command. Something flatter, procedural. Probably nothing, the man with the glasses said, setting his empty cup down. The porcelain clicked softly against wood. They run drills all the time. No one argued. A faint smell crept into the room. Oil, or something burnt, carried in through a vent. It was subtle, easily dismissed as the building's age catching up with it. Still, the man near the stove turned the burner down a notch, as if heat itself had become suspicious. The curtain at the window fluttered again. This time, it wasn't from vibration. It was wind. The overcast sky outside had shifted, the gray deepening into something heavier. Light drained slowly from the day, not dramatically, but with the steady patience of a tide. The older man by the window spoke without turning around. That road's busier than usual. He didn't specify which road. Everyone knew. They're probably rerouting, someone said. Temporary. Temporary was a useful word. It suggested reversibility. It suggested a future where things returned to how they'd been. A phone rang somewhere else in the building. Not this room. Down the hall, then farther away. The sound echoed briefly through the walls before being swallowed. No footsteps followed it toward them. The ledger sat where it had been placed, stamp still resting on top. The weight of it seemed greater now, as if the book were quietly accumulating mass. At the map table, the man tracing routes earlier returned, pencil in hand. He drew a short line, erased it, drew it again slightly offset. The eraser left a smudge he didn't bother to clean. Perfection was losing its appeal. Does anyone else hear that? The younger man asked suddenly. They all paused, listened. For a moment there was nothing. Then, faint, distant, almost imagined, a low, continuous sound, like pressure building somewhere far away. It wasn't loud enough to identify. It didn't have edges. It simply existed. Probably the weather, someone said. Yeah, another agreed too quickly. Weather does that. The younger man nodded and said nothing more. He pressed his watch strap looser on his wrist. In the quiet that followed, small things continued to happen. Ink dried. Steam dissipated. A loose floorboard creaked when someone shifted their foot. Outside, the engine started again, coughing once before settling into its familiar rhythm. Normality reasserted itself, piece by piece, stubborn and convincing. And yet, beneath it all, there was a growing sense, not sharp, not urgent, but undeniable, that something had already begun moving, far beyond the reach of the room, following a path no one inside was quite willing to trace all the way to its end. Time began to behave differently. Not faster, not slower, just uneven, like a watch with a loose spring, some seconds dragging their weight behind them while others slipped past unnoticed. The wall clock kept ticking, faithful to its mechanism, but the room no longer moved in step with it. The radio fell silent. Not static, not interference. Silence. The glow on the dial remained, the numbers unchanged, but the sound simply ceased, as if someone on the other end had set the world down gently and walked away. A few men waited for it to return on its own. When it didn't, one of them leaned forward and tapped the side of the set with 2 fingers. Nothing. He adjusted the dial by a fraction, then put it back where it had been, careful not to disturb whatever fragile balance existed between signal and absence. In the hallway, footsteps increased. Not hurried, not running. Just more frequent, overlapping where before they had come one at a time. Doors opened and closed with greater purpose now, no longer lingering in the threshold. Voices carried in short bursts, clipped and low, stripped of casual filler. Inside the room, no one acknowledged the change directly. The man at the desk reread the paper he had already read twice. The words did not change, but the way they sat on the page did. He folded it, unfolded it, smoothed it flat with the heel of his hand. His thumb lingered at the bottom margin, where a signature would go if one were required. There was no line for it. That omission felt intentional. At the window, the older man shifted his stance. He had been standing with his weight on one leg for a long time, a posture born of patience. Now he redistributed it, feet planted more evenly, as if bracing for something he refused to name. Outside, the road he had mentioned earlier had slowed. Vehicles moved in clusters instead of singles, spacing tighter, drivers leaning forward over their wheels. The kettle, forgotten, began to boil in earnest. Steam hissed from beneath the lid, then rattled it softly. The sound threaded through the room, persistent and rising. No one moved to stop it at first. It was only when the lid began to dance, tapping metal against metal, that someone crossed the room and lifted the kettle off the heat. The burner was turned down, then off entirely. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. "Power's flickering," someone said quietly. It wasn't a question. The lamp above the table dimmed for a fraction of a second, then steadied. The filament held, but the warning had been given, a reminder that the room depended on systems beyond its walls. The phone rang. This time it was this room. Every head turned at once. No one moved. The ringing was sharp, intrusive, out of place against the careful restraint that had defined the day. It rang again, then a third time, each peal identical to the last. The sound filled the room without echo, as if the walls had decided to listen. The man at the desk stood. His chair scraped softly across the floor, the noise oddly loud. He took 2 steps, then hesitated, hand hovering inches from the receiver. In that pause lived 1,000 smaller decisions. Who should answer? What should be said? How much could be delayed? The phone rang again. He lifted the receiver. He did not speak at first. He listened, eyes fixed on nothing, jaw set in a way that suggested restraint rather than shock. Whatever came through the line was not dramatic. There was no raised voice, no urgency bleeding through the wire. It was measured, procedural, delivered with the calm confidence of someone following a script. "Yes," the man said finally. He listened again, nodded once, though no one could see it. "I understand." He replaced the receiver gently, aligning it perfectly in its cradle. The phone did not ring again. No one asked who had been on the line. No one asked what had been said. The answers were already present in the room, woven into the air like a smell no one wanted to identify. The younger man swallowed. His cracked watch ticked on. Outside, a distant sound rose. Not mechanical this time, not weather. Human voices, indistinct, carried by the wind, too far away to make out words. Close enough to confirm that others were reacting to something, somewhere. The man with the cigarette finally lit one. He took a single drag and let the smoke sit in his lungs before releasing it slowly. His hand trembled just enough to be noticeable if you were looking for it. "At this point," he said, not to anyone in particular, "changing course would be complicated." Complicated was a careful word. It implied difficulty without impossibility. It implied effort, coordination, explanation. It stopped short of saying too late. No one contradicted him. The ledger was opened again, not to write, just to look. The fresh entry stared back, ink now fully dry, immutable. A fact, no longer a process. At the map table, the pencil was set down parallel to the ruler. Tools returning to rest. The building gave a low groan as something shifted deep within it. Pipes, supports, foundations responding to a pressure they had not been designed to feel yet. The sound passed and did not repeat. For a moment, it seemed as though someone might speak, might suggest a pause, might ask for confirmation or clarification or mercy disguised as procedure. Instead, the clock advanced another second. And in that quiet movement, small, precise, irreversible, the last open space where things could still be stopped began to narrow, unseen, closing without ceremony. Nothing announced itself. There was no signal, no command carried on a raised voice, no sharp sound to mark the crossing. If anyone had been waiting for a clear moment, a line drawn across the floor, a bell, a word spoken aloud, they would have missed it entirely. It happened the way most irreversible things do, through procedure. The man at the desk took the stamp in his hand again. This time he didn't hesitate. He opened the ink pad, pressed the stamp down once to coat it evenly, then lifted it and held it above the paper. For a fraction of a second, the stamp hovered there, suspended, its wooden handle steady between his fingers. No one spoke. The room seemed to contract, not physically, but in attention. Every small sound, breath, fabric shifting, the faint hum of the lamp, felt closer, sharper, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. The stamp came down. The sound was dull and final, a soft thud that carried more weight than any shouted order. Ink spread into the fibers of the page, dark and precise. When the stamp lifted again, the mark remained, perfect and indifferent. That was all. No reaction followed. No intake of breath. No muttered curse. No visible relief. The men in the room absorbed the moment the way stone absorbs rain, silently, without protest. The ledger was closed. The act felt ceremonial in its restraint. The man slid the book into the drawer beneath the desk, pushed it in until it clicked shut, then locked it. The key turned once cleanly. He removed it and placed it on the desk, not pocketing it, not hiding it. Leaving it there felt more honest. Outside the window, the light had shifted again. The gray had deepened into something closer to steel, the sky lowering as if pressing down on the city. A gust of wind rattled the glass more forcefully than before. The bent nail holding the curtain finally gave a fraction of an inch, letting the fabric sway freely for the first time that day. Someone moved to fix it. He reached up, fingers brushing the nail, then stopped. The curtain settled on its own, hanging crooked now. He left it that way. In the hallway, footsteps began to move with purpose. Not hurried, not panicked, but coordinated. Doors opened and closed in sequence, not randomly. Voices passed by. No longer murmurs, but clear enough to recognize tone, if not content. The building was shifting into a different mode of existence, one that did not require consultation from this room anymore. The radio crackled back to life. Not a voice, just a burst of static, louder than before, as if something had been forced through a narrowed channel. The man nearest it reached out instinctively, then pulled his hand back. Whatever was happening on the other end no longer needed his adjustment. The kettle, forgotten again, had cooled. A thin ring of mineral residue marked where the waterline had been. Someone noticed it and turned the kettle upside down in the sink, letting the last drops run out. The sound of water hitting metal echoed briefly, then stopped. Small things were being put away now. Cups were stacked. A chair was nudged back under the table. The ruler was slid off the map and placed in a drawer. The map itself remained open, its edges curling slightly more than before, as if it were trying to pull away from the surface. The younger man stood up. He hadn't meant to. The movement surprised him. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed his sleeves, then checked his watch again. The crack in the glass seemed wider now, though he knew it wasn't. He loosened the strap another notch and exhaled. "Should I?" he began, then stopped. There was nothing left to offer. The phone did not ring again. Outside, the distant human noise grew louder. No longer just voices, but the layered sound of many people moving at once. Doors, engines, metal against metal. Somewhere farther away, a horn sounded, long and low, not in warning, but in acknowledgement. The man with the cigarette stubbed it out halfway through, the ember hissing faintly as it died. He crushed it harder than necessary, then wiped his fingers on a handkerchief that came away smudged with ink from the stamp he had handled earlier. Ink traveled easily. At the desk, the man who had done the stamping stood very still. He rested his hands on the wood, feeling its grain, its familiarity. He had spent years learning how to make his actions precise enough that they disappeared into routine. That skill was serving him well now. "Everything's in motion," he said quietly. He did not explain what everything meant. No one asked. Through the window, a vehicle turned onto the main road, then another behind it, then another. The spacing between them was deliberate, rehearsed. This was not confusion. This was alignment. The building's lights flickered once more, longer this time before stabilizing. The hum of electricity returned, steady but strained, like breath held too long. Someone sat down heavily, the chair creaking under the sudden weight. The sound broke the spell for just an instant, reminding them all that they were still bodies in a room, not names in a ledger or marks on a page. But that reminder didn't change anything. The door opened without a knock. A man stepped in. Someone new, someone whose uniform bore signs of having been outside longer than the rest. Dust clung to his boots. His collar was turned up against the wind. He looked around once, took in the room, the faces, the absence of urgency. "Orders have been distributed," he said. Distributed, not issued, not debated, already moving like blood through arteries that did not require permission from the heart. He left as efficiently as he had arrived. The door closed behind him, softer than it should have been. In the silence that followed, it became clear, not through any single sound or sight, but through the shape of the moment itself. that the window where intervention might have mattered had already slid shut. No one had slammed it. No one had even noticed it closing. They stood there, surrounded by the careful aftermath of their own restraint, while beyond the walls of the room, momentum carried forward on tracks that had just been locked into place, and whatever lay ahead no longer depended on what anyone in that room might choose to do next. The room settled into a stillness that was not calm, but finished. It was the kind of quiet that follows when all necessary actions have already been taken, and nothing remains but their consequences, still too distant to touch. Chairs were occupied again, though no one remembered sitting down. Bodies arranged themselves instinctively, as if preparing for a wait they had not agreed to but understood was unavoidable. The clock continued. Its sound felt closer now, no longer absorbed by conversation or movement. Each tick landed cleanly in the air, unchallenged. The second hand moved without hesitation anymore, as if whatever resistance it had sensed earlier had been resolved. At the window, the sky darkened another shade. Not night yet, just the deepening gray that erased edges and softened distances. Shapes outside blurred together, vehicles, figures, structures losing their individual meanings and becoming mass, direction, flow. The road carried them all the same way. Inside, breath slowed. Someone noticed the dust on the desk and brushed it away with the side of his hand. The gesture was unnecessary. The desk would not be inspected again today. Still, the need to restore surfaces persisted, a reflex left over from a world where order implied control. The radio remained on, emitting nothing. No static, no signal. Just the faint electrical presence of a device waiting to be spoken through again, or never. Its empty glow felt more deliberate than any broadcast. The phone hung silent on the wall. No one watched it now. Whatever calls were meant to come had already chosen their paths. In the drawer beneath the desk, the ledger stayed locked. The key lay untouched where it had been left, catching the lamp's light at a shallow angle. No one moved it. There was no longer any need to pretend the record was still open to revision. A low vibration passed through the building. This time it did not fade immediately. It lingered just long enough to be undeniable, then resolved into a steady pressure, as if something immense had begun moving far away, and the ground itself had decided to acknowledge it early. The walls absorbed it without complaint. The floor did not tremble. Only the men noticed, each in his own quiet way. One of them closed his eyes, not in prayer, not in fear, just to feel the moment without distraction, to confirm that it was real and not the result of too many hours spent waiting. When he opened them again, nothing had changed. That somehow made it worse. In the corner, a coat hung on a peg, forgotten. It swayed slightly, disturbed by a draft no one could feel. The motion was slow, pendulum-like, hypnotic. Back and forth, back and forth. Time expressed in fabric. Outside, a distant sound rolled across the air, too low to be called a noise, too broad to be a single source. It was not sudden. It did not demand attention. It simply arrived, like weather, like gravity. Someone at the table began to speak, then stopped himself. The words had formed too late to matter. He pressed his lips together and nodded once, as if agreeing with a conclusion no one had voiced. The younger man with the cracked watch checked it one last time. The hands were aligned in a way that made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't have explained why. He lowered his arm and let it hang at his side, finally surrendering the habit. The lamp flickered. Not off. Not on. Just enough to register the instability, to remind everyone that even light depended on systems now under strain. The filament held. The room remained visible. Faces stayed recognizable. For now. A sound passed overhead. Metal against air, distant but distinct. It did not linger. It did not return immediately. It left behind only the knowledge that something large had crossed a boundary above them. No one went to the window. There was nothing to see that would improve understanding. The clock marked another minute. In that minute, no new decisions were made. No corrections attempted. No hands reached for controls or papers or phones. The absence of action was complete, not from apathy, but from recognition. This part had already been decided elsewhere. The room existed now as a pocket of delayed awareness, a place where time stretched just enough to allow thought without influence. Outside, alignment continued. Inside, observation was all that remained. A breath was taken and held, then released. The building groaned again, deeper this time, a sound that traveled through supports and beams rather than air. It was the sound of pressure redistributing, of structures accepting weight they had not carried before. Somewhere beyond the walls, something reached its final position. Inside the room, nothing moved. Not yet. The clock's second hand approached the top of the dial, climbed toward it, hesitated for the briefest instant, and then continued forward, carrying the moment with it, right up to the edge of what was about to begin.